And I think one of the tendencies in South Africa is that democracy gets conflated with the idea of majoritarianism.
Yes,
So
exactly.
it's like, well, we have the majority, so everybody else can get stuffed if you disagree with us.
I know, well, the Free Market Foundation has a very strong brand also, not just in South Africa, but abroad. And the Free Market Foundation was also very outspoken several decades ago about the trajectory of South Africa and where things should be headed and so forth. But what you said now reminds me of a comment that a Zimbabwean farmer made back when I was with AfriForum, which I've really thought of a lot. It was one of the many who had to flee the country, whose property was taken. And at one point, this person spoke about the difference between South Africa and Zimbabwe. And then one of the questions is, are we headed to a Zimbabwe-type scenario? And this person said, maybe not, because there are some important differences. And one of the biggest differences is that in South Africa, we are very well organized in civil society. And in Zimbabwe, they didn't have that. They placed most of their hope on opposition parties or trying to influence the ruling party from within and so forth. But there wasn't much effort put on building institutions, sort of, you could say, outside of party politics. And I think this is something that really stands out about South African society today is, firstly, the variety of civil society institutions like the ones you mentioned and many others, but also that they are very vocal and outspoken. And I think they are regarded by the public at large as leaders in the conversation. That I think we can frame it as such. So how do you see this role between civil society then as opposed to politics, as opposed to political parties? To what extent should there be a connection or an interplay, or to what extent do you think it should function separately?
Yeah, I think the interplay is healthy. I think in maybe other markets like the United States, the United Kingdom, if you think of in the UK, the entity like the Institute of Economic Affairs played a really important role in influencing Margaret Thatcher's liberalization program. So in some ways you create this ecosystem of ideas that influences the political elite. But I think you also have to be a bit cautious about overstating your influence on politicians and overly depending on politicians as well, because politicians also have their own set of incentives. They're not necessarily driven by the same kind of principles or ideas. They're in the business of getting votes and being re-elected, and have often ideas that might be contrary to think tanks. So I think what's beneficial about a think tank is that it doesn't have to play to the gallery. It doesn't have to necessarily play this game of winning elections, but it can say, well, what are the best policies? What are the best ideas that can help to move a country or an economy forward? And, I think also building pressure on the political establishment is really important because of the reasons that I've given. Sometimes there might be some kind of populist idea that gains momentum within society, and you need to be able to check that and act against that.
Yeah.
Then I also think, it's fine to have this plethora of civil society organizations, but you do need other institutional mechanisms in place. Like you need a strong legal and judicial system that's independent. Our organization and the organizations that you've been affiliated with have been very active in engaging in public interest litigation. But, as we've seen recently, like with the Kill the Boer case, the hate speech case against Julius Malema, the Constitutional Court has even refused to even hear that matter on appeal. So that's, I think, very concerning, that you need the court system to be independent and protecting life, liberty, and property and the constitutional values of the country. But at the moment, I think there is a bit of a risk that through mechanisms like the Judicial Services Commission, that the courts have become overly politicized and become very sensitive to political pressures, which I think is very dangerous, and we should push back against.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about that, but I want to just touch on the point you made about incentives for political parties. Churchill had that famous saying of democracy being the worst system, but it's better than the ones that have been tried. And I think there's a lot of truth in that there are no perfect systems. I still think democracy is the best system, but we can talk about what is a democracy and what is it supposed to be. But one of the problems with democracy as we know it today is that for political parties or governments, there are very few long-term incentives. The most important incentive is the next election, which will be in 5 years or 4 years or whatever. And so one of the challenges that comes as a result of that is it's in a sense incentivized to for example, raise social grants. Or to incur more debt and to use that for sort of short-term, the type of policies, economic policies that might bring short-term relief, but that isn't sustainable in the long run. And how do we make sense of that? I'd love to hear your comment on this sort of this phenomenon and if this is something that can be addressed in a way.
Yeah, and I think one of the tendencies in South Africa is that democracy gets conflated with the idea of majoritarianism.
Yes,
so
exactly.
It's like, well, we have the majority, so everybody else can get stuffed if you disagree with us. And I think a truly functional democracy is one where there are actually constraints on power, that there are kind of rules and systems that also bind political actors in terms of and constrain them in terms of their actions. So, you need those checks and balances. And unfortunately, in the South African context, I mean, if you had to study the Constitution without any context or understanding of South Africa, you would think, oh, this is an amazing Constitution.
Good, yes.
You have all these Chapter 9 institutions that, like the Public Protector, that act to limit power, or you have a formal separation of powers between the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. And, this is all wonderful. But in practice, politics sometimes and frequently actually override some of those constraints.
Yes.
And so that's why I think the political context is very important. So an organization like the Free Market Foundation, we really value our independence. We're non-partisan, but for many decades we were kind of in the old model of a think tank that we're these clever guys who put out policy documents and we make submissions to Parliament. And we hope that through rational persuasion that our arguments will be adopted by the political establishment. But often those reports and those submissions get put into folder 13, and they get discarded and disregarded because it's not in the interests of the politicians to adopt those policies.
So I want to ask you about that. So what's the balance then between the thinking and the tanking, if we could say that?
Yeah.
Because I think on the one hand, we need proper research and policy papers, but on the other hand, people always say, we need to take action and so forth. But there's also the risk of taking action without thinking and not having proper research. How do you see this as the balance between these two?
Yeah, I think indiscriminate action is actually not a good thing. I think you want to be very strategic about what the goals are that you want. I mean, I think we're very fortunate in that we have a framework that guides us. We're not necessarily in the game of just trying to get clicks on videos or on articles. So, I mean, if you take an absurd example, cat videos on the internet, they get a lot of clicks. But are you doing anything with that? Not necessarily. And yeah, I mean, I think it's fantastic that we've had this explosion of these alternative media platforms in South Africa. But I think just garnering large audiences, that's not enough. You need to kind of instrumentalize that towards some kind of further end. And that's why I'm really encouraged to see what work you're doing with the Pioneer Initiative.
Yeah.
And so, but definitely gaining access to audiences, I think, is really important for communicating your message. But look, I think in the current environment, I think we do need much more overt pressure. We need civil society organizations to form a balance of forces against the worst successes of the ANC's misgovernance and the ideological underpinnings of the National Democratic Revolution. Because the NDR itself, which basically, as you know, seeks to capture democratic institutions and subvert those and use those for the exercise of power and to achieve socialist ends.
Yes. Yeah.
You can pick your example: national health insurance, or expropriation without compensation,
education, everything. Yes.
Yeah, BEE is an instrument in that regard as well.
Yeah.
And yeah, so we actually need forms of concrete resistance. So in the example of writing a deep policy document, as we have done through our Liberty First series, which was over 100 pages of policy analysis that we released at the beginning of 2025. That helps you in terms of sharpening your analysis and clarifying exactly what you want to achieve. But that's not sufficient. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. You need to use that to actually build power around those ideas.
Of course.
And so that's why we're very keen on these bottom-up, decentralized political initiatives. We ran a campaign last year called the Campaign for Home Rule, where we want to encourage municipalities, but also business chambers, community groups, community policing forums to start acquiring power for themselves.
Yes.
So there are myriad problems in South Africa. A little think tank like the Free Market Foundation is not necessarily going to be able to solve all of those things. If you consider an entity like AfriForum, there is much more of a kind of practical application of that philosophy on the ground. There's
community organizing and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, I remember you touring me around the AfriForum offices, and we went to go and see the Central Command Center for the, as part of the efforts to resist farm attacks and so on. And those kind of initiatives are really important. But for an entity like ours, we want to plant the seed of these ideas that actually more communities should be engaging in this kind of activity. So whether that's private businesses and business associations or some of these groups in small towns that have collapsed and seen their services eroded away, there's a lot of value, I think, still remaining in South Africa,
of course,
and a lot of people who have a vested interest in seeing South Africa succeed. But I think waiting for politicians to come along and fix these problems is not the correct strategy. We need to actually start solving these problems ourselves.
So